My name is Nicholas Ashford. I'm a professor of technology and policy at the Institute, and I teach courses in sustainable development and environmental law, policy, and economics. Well, I'm concerned about a lot of aspects of the technology. One has to do with the effects on employment and the fact that technology is rapidly replacing jobs, and that there is a crisis in terms of the purchasing power that workers have. And the employment issue turns out to be a major issue in both developed and developing countries. So the questions that I'm involved with has to do with how we can reorient the industrial state so that the development of technology create both profit centers and employment for most of the people. That is pure nonsense. Technology has been replacing jobs since 1945 and much more so since 1970. Not only have the jobs changed in their character, but they've changed in terms of the wages and the security of employment. So there was one time when so-called technological displacement was never admitted to exist. For example, the OECD for years put out publications on how more jobs were going to be created than destroyed. But now we are facing up to the fact that, in fact, that is not true. We are rapidly replacing labor with energy, with physical technology, and with all other kinds of automation that portend a very difficult future. Those are two different issues. I mean, population increases also mean there's a potential increase in market size. So population increases per se doesn't necessarily portend badly for employment. But the aging population is another question, because when people cease to work, they cease to make the kind of salary that they need to support themselves. And it's ironic that at a time when younger employees are finding it harder and harder to get a job, that we're asking older employees to stay on longer in order not to deplete the Social Security system. So you can't have it both ways. You can't ask the older population to work longer and yet provide the opportunities for new populations to enter the workplace. And probably the most disruptive situation is for young people not to be able to find jobs. I mean, in Europe now, across the board, Southern Europe has 25% unemployment, but the youth unemployment is 50%. And in Spain and in Greece, these are really unstable situations, both socially and economically. Well, there are a number of answers. First of all, the people in economic power are not going to let a revolution happen. So there will not be a second French Revolution. But the other thing is that, especially in the Southern European countries where the family support is very significant, families support the members of the family that are not able to work or do not find jobs. This is certainly true in Greece. Parents help their children, brothers and sisters help each other. The second answer is that more and more hours are worked by family members to support a level of living that they formerly had. So you're finding a very difficult situation. If it were not for the social cohesion of the southern countries particularly, you would have revolution. I don't think you could have this in the UK. I don't think you could have this in Germany. I think the book by Brynjolfsson and McAtee from the Sloan School that is called The Second Machine Age is a very good reference, I think, here. On the one hand, they talk about robotics and artificial intelligence and IT increasing the economic benefits to a country and to the industrial establishment, and hiring a very small number at high wages of specialists in this area, while the rest of the middle class hollows out and moves towards the low end of wages. So, this is an unprecedented time when everybody is seeking to replace labor. And the problem is, if every industry and every sector replaces labor, there's nobody left to buy the products of the industrial state. So we are, in effect, killing the goose that laid the golden egg. I mean, not only is capitalism in crisis, but we're very likely to have a magnitude of shift in the nature of the industrial state. And people are not planning for it, and they're not thinking about it. Look, the unemployment rate may not look very different, but when you look at, in this country, for example, people talk about the rate falling from 5.5 to 5.2%. This doesn't count people who have stopped looking for jobs, and it doesn't account for the fact that people who have rejoined the workforce are working at a fraction of the wage that they used to have. But you are seeing all of this manifested in a very low level of industrial activity because demand is down, which means purchasing power is not sufficient to absorb the productive capacity of a country. And if a country may say, well, okay, fine, we will trade outside the country, we'll find consumers outside. This is a worldwide phenomenon. In China, many of the women have been sent back to the factories because there is not the pre-existing demand for industrial goods. So we are facing a crisis in demand and overcapacity that doesn't look as if it's going to be satisfied by sufficient purchasing power. And people like Stiglitz have written about this, Jamie Galbraith, Atkinson in the UK, who's written a book called Inequality, What Can Be Done. But some people and some industrialists and many politicians on the left and the right think that we're going to have a recovery of the economic system. There's no chance that we're going to have a recovery in the economic system. We need a transformation, not a recovery. Well, we are all going to have to face the problem that we don't have enough people working at a high enough wage in any of the countries. And as far as China is concerned, I mean, there are concerns about the economy, economic welfare, there's concerns about employment, but remember that global climate change and environmental issues are looming very, very difficult right now. And the point is that when China ceases to be able to export much of its goods, it's going to convert into a consumer society like Japan did after it exploited its productive capacity. And can you imagine 1.6 billion Chinese consuming energy and materials? Can you imagine what's going to happen to the planet? And of course, it's not just the planet. When the environment goes south, so does the economy. So you're going to have enormous problems in terms of increased respiratory disease, cancer, a whole variety of other things which have been ignored because, in fact, people talk about only global climate change, but there's toxic pollution. In China, you can't breathe the air. The homes are fueled by coal and by wood. And so we are at the end of this growth period. And people like Robert Ayers, who's an energy economist at Fontainebleau at the European Business School, talks about the end of exponential growth. The smart money for the next decade is not on the traditional 6 to 9% annual growth, but 2 to 3%. And that 2 to 3% will be owned and enjoyed by a relatively narrow group of industries and technologies. It's not going to be spread evenly. As far as work is concerned, there will be those who continue to work. There will be those who cannot find a job. I and others have proposed that we move to a 4-day work week, but maintaining pay parity. That is, you pay workers for 5 hours of work, but you have them work 4 hours so that we can spread the work and the purchasing power around. Industry's not going to be enthusiastic about that. But you have to have a transfer of wealth and the creation of new purchasing power by some mechanism. If you don't, you're not going to have the demand that the producers of goods and services want there to be to absorb the product of the industrial state. You cannot leave to the private sector to solve this problem. Private sector has a role to play, but government has to step in and be a trustee for consumers, for workers, for the general population. If the government doesn't do it, because the private sector controls the governmental agenda, we are in for big trouble. We are in very serious problems. Well, I mean, technology is neither good nor bad in itself. It depends how it's used. It depends upon whose economic and social interests it promotes. I mean, obviously, the internet has given a lot of information and a lot of capacity to the general population. It's also given rise to communications, some of which are reliable, some of which are not reliable. But the internet doesn't have a quality control, which one can argue exists in other forms of communication. So you can spread the word about X, Y, or Z. It may or may not have any real truth behind it. And you know, we see the rise of right-wing parties, anti-immigrant parties, and this is fueled by basically the internet and free expression. But both good and bad come out of stirring people up, crowdsourcing, and a whole variety of other things. The problem is that the economic elite control the press in most of the developed countries, if not the developing countries. So you don't get the truth. And if you don't get the truth, you can't have an intelligent discussion of what policy should be. And that's the problem. The problem is that a very small number of people actually control the political agenda. In this country, the work of Gillens and his colleague at Princeton show that the economic elite, we're talking about the upper 0.1%, basically 94% of the time get what they want out of the Congress or the legislature. The public gets what it wants, like raising the minimum wage, 6% of the time. And it gets 6% of the time because that's the agreement between the economic elite and the people. 94% of the time, the economic elite and the bulk of the population do not want or get the same thing. So the republic, democracy, is in very serious state of affairs right now because we have the private control, not the government control, the private sector control of the public, of the means of communication. And certainly IT has facilitated that. Well, you have to have profit to stimulate innovation for the most part. People aren't going to do things for nothing or the goodness of their heart. So, I mean, I'm not arguing for socialism, I'm not arguing for state ownership. In fact, we see what state ownership has done in China, okay? So you need to have profit, reasonable profit to stimulate innovation, and you need to be able to promote technology for the good of the people, not for the good, basically, of the profiteers. But public ownership of the means of production is not going to happen in a real sense. Now, it may be that communities do have their farmers markets and they do build their own hospitals out of desperation because the state no longer functions. But the role of the state has been underemphasized by basically conservatives and the right wing, arguing that the government should only grease the wheel and the private sector will produce the goods for the society. It's not true, any more than it's true that the conservatives who argue you decrease taxes on the rich will produce jobs. It did when Henry Ford and Carnegie were creating factories and productive capacity. It doesn't happen anymore with money chasing money rather than being invested in R&D. You're not going to have, basically, the deployment of finances for the public good. We need to bring back government very strongly. I'm not arguing for a bigger government. I'm arguing for a stronger government, one which acts as a trustee. I mean, in Spain, you have Podemos, you have the political party, which, of course, doesn't seem to be able to persuade anybody that things ought to change. But the victories of Syriza in Greece show that really people do understand that what is in their interest is not in what the interest has been of basically conservative and private sector controlled government. You need to have real democracy. And Asimoglu here at MIT has shown in a nice book called Why Nations Fail, that nations which are not democratic and are extractive and exploitive of basically people in the environment do not last politically. Ultimately, they fail. It's only democracies in the true sense of the word, and one can argue how much of us really actually have democracy. But I mean, democracy is much more about elections. It's about governance, it's about fairness, it's about trusteeship, it's about taking care of, to make sure that everybody has the essential goods and services. It's not about profit. Profit is a mechanism, profit is not an end. And I've written about these things in a book called Technology, Globalization, and Sustainable Development, Yale Press, myself and my colleague Ralph Hall, in which we talk about the need to transform the industrial state, that bubbles, which imply recovery, are not the answer.